Welcome back to the History of the Church. Today we are going to discuss a little bit more and recap on what we talked about with the councils. And today we're going to look at the schism. So far we haven't seen any of the real schisms, but I believe here with Abuna Theodore we're going to see the schisms take place. Can you walk us through that, Abuna?
All right, so as we talked about last time, we were referencing Ephesus, and we're talking about the issue about the unity of Christ as fully human and fully divine. And we now got to Eutyches as well, and we said that Eutyches had this idea that Christ was one nature, but that nature was only divine. And a term that some people sometimes use is Monophysitism. So Monophysite comes from Greek, two words. So mono is one, physit comes from physis, which is a Greek meaning nature, the one nature. So because he kept on saying it's just one nature, therefore they labeled that Monophysite. So that was a Monophysite opinion of thinking of only one nature, which is only the divine nature, not one united nature like we the Copts like to talk about the nature of Christ. So we talked about also Flavian, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, and he brought Eutyches and he excommunicated him and then said that Christ is in two natures. And the Alexandrians at the time, and the Pope at that time was Pope Dioscorus. So Pope Dioscorus, or Dioscorus, depending on the very Coptic pronunciation, had a problem with this idea of saying in two natures. He said if we say in two natures, we're separating Christ again into two. We have to say one nature out of two natures, but now one nature united together. So during this time, the council that we said that happened at Constantinople, where Eutyches was excommunicated, was around 448 AD, and Pope Dioscorus at that time in Alexandria wanted a new council because he was unhappy with this position. So there's this new council that happens in 449, and it's during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II, and it gathers in Ephesus. So we call this a second Council of Ephesus.
So this is part of the three that we accept as a
Yeah,
Coptic
so
church?
it's not really ecumenical. So this is exactly, it was supposed to be an ecumenical council, accepted by all the bishops, but for the reasons we will explain later now, it wasn't accepted by most of the church because of what we're going to discuss now. So it is a council that was presided over by Pope Dioscorus at the time, but unfortunately, a few things happened in that council that caused the problem of the schism later. So what happens? Pope Dioscorus brings in Eutyches and brings in also Flavian, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then Rome, the Bishop of Rome at the time, was Pope Leo I. The Roman Catholics referred to him as Pope Leo the Great, and he writes a letter. Eutyches at the time sends a letter complaining to the Pope of Rome about the way he's been treated. Probably maybe before the council he was excommunicated in, or maybe after, I'd have to double check. But Pope Leo sends a letter which is called the Tome of Leo.
What does tome mean?
So the tome is basically, it means like a large letter or a large writing or like a small book or something, where he writes his position on what does it mean that Christ is human and divine at the same time. So the problem with that letter, or the Tome of Leo, at least from the Alexandrian position, he uses these sort of terms. He says each form, he's talking about humanity and divinity, each form does the acts which belong to it in communion with the other. The Word performs that what belongs to the Word, and the flesh carries out what belongs to the flesh. One of these shines out in miracles, and the other succumbs to injuries.
Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, I can tell. So kind of like, you know, the people back then wrote in a very philosophical way and a very technical way. Basically, he's saying that Christ has the two natures, and each nature does what's natural for it. So Christ is divine, so the divine nature shines out in miracles. And then his humanity succumbs, like is, subjected to injuries. So he wrote that letter, and it was also sent with the delegation that attends this second Council of Ephesus in 449. Now what happens, Dioscorus, being the Pope of Alexandria, he was the head of the council, and Eutyches somehow convinces Dioscorus that he has accepted the faith and he is not talking about this heresy that people were accusing him of. And Dioscorus, for some reason, seems to believe Eutyches, and he basically brings him back into the church, and he says, you're no longer excommunicated. And Flavian, who was the Bishop of Constantinople at the time, was insistent on saying in two natures. And Pope Dioscorus says, no, that's Nestorianism, we can't accept that, and he excommunicates, the council excommunicates Flavian at the time. So that becomes a big political problem, and we'll get into that in a minute. Now, the Tome of Leo was sent with the Roman delegates during that council, but it wasn't read. Why it wasn't read, the history books aren't entirely clear. Some people say perhaps he didn't have enough time to read it. Perhaps there was a concern about the content of the letter, and Pope Dioscorus didn't want to, talk about it. But the history then says, the Coptic history books speak about how Dioscorus read this letter later and felt it was Nestorian. When he talks about two natures and one does this and one does that, he felt that, no, that sounds like two natures again, and it sounds like Nestorianism again. So he excommunicates the tome, and he says, this tome is not the correct faith, and he actually says, this is a heresy.
So then what is this, what effect does this have?
Now Alexandria, the See of Alexandria and the See of Constantinople, you have two powerful bishops, two important cities in the Roman Empire and important for Christianity, that seem to look like, there's a power struggle. That's basically what it starts. At least that's the concept from the Constantinopolitan side. You have to bear in mind, Constantinople is the capital of the empire. And the emperor is sitting there, and their bishops get excommunicated. So from the perspective of Constantinople, Alexandria is the reason that at least 3 or 4 of their bishops got excommunicated. So if you want to recap and you go earlier, remember we said in the Council of Constantinople, who was the heretic at the time? Macedonius. He was bishop of Constantinople. End result, he was excommunicated. Nestorius was bishop of Constantinople, and he also got excommunicated. Flavian, this is the most recent one, he was Constantinople, and he was also excommunicated. And who was involved in each of these stories? Alexandria. So the Bishop of Alexandria is excommunicating their bishops. And there's also a fourth story where, unfortunately, this is the more unfortunate one, St. John Chrysostom. So St. John Chrysostom, earlier on, in the earlier part of the history, was also Bishop of Constantinople. Okay. And not for heresy though, but there was a dispute between him and St. Cyril's predecessor. So St. Cyril, who was the 24th Bishop of Alexandria, his predecessor, he was called Pope Theophilus, he was the 23rd Bishop. He had a dispute with St. John Chrysostom, and he presided over a council which actually excommunicated St. John Chrysostom. And St. John Chrysostom died in exile, and it was only later that his body was brought back to Constantinople and he was exonerated, and they said that, he was wrongfully accused. Now, that's maybe something we can talk about maybe at a different history session, but suffice to say now, here we are at around 449, 450 AD, and Constantinople, the people in Constantinople and the emperor and the empress are looking and saying, who do these Alexandrians think they are?
So is this where the rift,
the rift starts to happen, exactly. So you start to see that the Constantinopolitans are looking at this and saying, for how long will these Alexandrians think they're so powerful, and they keep excommunicating our bishops, and Alexandria is not supposed to be this powerful thing. We are the imperial city. So these past two councils especially, Ephesus II and Ephesus I, are displaying the power of the Patriarch of Alexandria. And it seems to be in competition with the power of Constantinople. So then we deal with a twist of fate. What happens is that the Emperor Theodosius II dies in around the year 450, and he doesn't leave an heir. There's no heir to the throne. So his sister, Pulcheria, she, up to that point, had taken a vow of celibacy. She wasn't going to get married. But at that point, she decided to marry one of the generals in the army, Marcian. And Marcian became proclaimed as emperor, and she as empress. And they started to feel that the power of Alexandria needs to be checked. We need to, set a limit, set a boundary to this, this bishop who seems to think he's the most powerful bishop in the Mediterranean. And then at the same time, that sort of fell in with a problem with Pope Leo of Rome. The perception from the Coptic history is that Pope Leo was really upset with Pope Dioscorus because he dared to anathematize his tome. Basically said that this tome is wrong. So at this point, we see where the position of the two imperial cities, Rome and Constantinople, they're the two seats of the empire. We're looking at Alexandria as this power that need to be contained. And that's where they start to come together and say, we need a new council to basically erase all the effects and that Dioscorus had affected in the empire, and we need to check the power of Alexandria. And I think we're sort of running out of time, so we can sort of maybe go into more details in the next episode, but just basically to say that they wanted a council that would reverse everything that Dioscorus did. So they had to put Dioscorus in the seat of someone who is accused. He had to be accused of things, and this is where all these issues come together at Chalcedon, which ultimately, unfortunately, leads to the first schism of the church.
Thank you so much, Abuna. We've learned a lot once again. And next time we will continue with the history of the church and hopefully gain some more knowledge.